So hello, bonjour. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Mobilizing a Global Response. This webinar is the first in a series of webinars co-hosted by LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network, and IDRC, the International Development Research Center. We're delighted to have close to 200 attendees for this webinar and a very exciting and a distinguished panel of colleagues to discuss the important and timely report from the Honourable Bob Rae, now Ambassador Rae, Canada's permanent representative and ambassador to the UN in New York. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And I also have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. With the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, SSHRC, LERRN is a 7-year partnership between 4 Canadian universities, INGO partners, an advisory committee that includes IDRC, the Government of Canada, UNHCR, and others, and working groups in Kenya, Tanzania, Lebanon, and Jordan. Our goal is to understand and enhance the role of civil society in the refugee regime, especially supporting localized and refugee voices. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that Carleton University and my basement, where I am today, are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. I make that territorial land acknowledgement not just out of respect, but to underscore that the territory on which I now sit is not immune from the issues of dislocation and dispossession that we'll be discussing today. Our webinar today will include introductory comments from our panelists and a time for Q&A with the audience for the last 20 minutes of the webinar. To pose a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please make your question as concise as possible so that we can cover as many questions as possible in the time available. Please note that the chat function for attendees has been disabled, and please also note that we will be recording, or that we are now recording, this webinar. And while this webinar is a space for open and frank discussion, we remind all participants to engage in the discussion in a way that is respectful and considerate. Attendees who engage in harmful or hurtful practices will be removed. And as I said, we will be recording today's webinar. We're also using the hashtag that you see at the bottom of the screen there, hashtag global response, as we live tweet. For more specifics about the bios of our distinguished speakers and the moderators today, please visit carleton.ca/learn/upcoming events. We would love for you to engage in the conversation both in the Q&A and on Twitter. And with that, it's my real pleasure to turn proceedings over to the wonderful Ariane Dahan. Ariane is the director of the Inclusive Economies Program at IDRC. He's been a great supporter of this area of work and was an active participant in events that we co-hosted in Geneva at last year's Global Refugee Forum. Ariane will introduce our speakers and moderate the first portion of the webinar. So with that, Ariane, over to you.
Thank you so much, James. Welcome, everybody. It's my honor to welcome our guest speakers as well as the guests to this webinar. We will examine the important and timely recommendations found in the report produced by the Honourable Bob Rae in his capacity as Canada's Special Envoy on Humanitarian and Refugee Issues. As James said, my name is Ariane Dahan. I'm the director of one of IDRC's divisions that works on inclusive economies. As IDRC is part of Canada's international development efforts, and we're about to launch a new strategy, and the consultations and the work we've been doing with James and his team are very helpful in informing how our future research agenda might contribute to the important development objectives. Just want to highlight that we're extremely happy to be partnering with LERRN, with Professor James Milner and his team. We share with LERRN the objective to ensure the voices of those closest to the issues of forced displacement are heard and amplified locally as well as globally. We know that while most displaced today, some 80 million live in the global south, the vast majority of published research on forced displacement emanates from northern scholars and academics, and we want to contribute to changing this equation. I will be doing two things. I will be your timekeeper. I will be holding up a 1-minute sign when the time is up. We have very little time and we want to stick to that to allow for questions and answers. And I will be introducing each participant before they speak. And please note that there's an extended bio of each speaker on the LERRN website. So with that, welcome again, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for the efforts. Thanks, everybody, for joining. And our first speaker is, as we mentioned, the Honourable Bob Rae, who is Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations in New York. And Mr. Rae, as most of you will know, is also the former Premier of Ontario and former interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Over to you, Mr. Rae. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for continued engagement with the network and with IDRC. You're on mute, Bob.
Just need you to unmute, Bob.
There you go.
This is called the Trump button. Anyway.
If only.
I'm going to get right to it because the time is short, and I want to give everyone a chance to engage as much as possible. My report actually focuses on two big areas. One is the issue of more broadly of what is happening with respect to humanitarian assistance, and to what extent the issues that we're dealing with both on humanitarian issues and on refugees in particular have been aggravated and accentuated by the pandemic. The recommendations really are divided into two parts. One of them has to do with Canada's overall aid effort. It has to do with this continuing orthodoxy that I disagree with, that there has to be a line between humanitarian and development assistance, because I think that the length of stay in refugee camps, for example, and the extent to which humanitarian issues have become permanent issue means we really have to break these walls down. And I'm glad to say that that's already happening. I think in most of the large aid agencies, including Canada's, I think that recognition is now quite widespread. Also calling for increased effort by Canada and increasing the aid budget. I was very glad to see the announcement this weekend about the additional monies for this fiscal year, and then a commitment to be prepared to accept proposals for increased assistance in the years ahead. And that's something, of course, that I know people are going to be very actively engaged with over the next few months. With respect to the refugee crisis, I think the report really focuses on a couple of things that struck me out of my experience with in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar and the Rohingya crisis, and really tried to take that some lessons learned from that for me, and started to see if how they apply to what's going on in the rest of the world, particularly in Africa, which is obviously a considerable focus for all of us as we look at the extent of the challenge of human displacement. And really what I try to do there is suggest that we need to really begin to recognize that the world is changing, that refugee camps have become permanent settlements in many, many cases, that the voices of refugees need to be not just amplified, but listened to. It came out of my experience in Cox's Bazar, where as an old politician walking through a camp, you sort of say, well, how does this place run? Like, what's the power structure? What's going on here? And people, kind of look at you with amazement and say, no, well, we're getting to that. We're starting to set up some structures, but we have to focus on on the immediate emergency, which I totally understand. But we also have to recognize that there are inevitably and naturally and very, very healthily, and it's a source of tremendous encouragement to see to what extent refugees insist on carrying on and having a voice, on dealing with their situation, and being able to create the structures that allow them to move forward. And so we have to look at funding. We have to look at how do funding mechanisms in Canada facilitate that, or how to, or not. And I think we've seen some really good examples where Canadian missions abroad have been very receptive to dealing with that. I saw that firsthand in Dhaka. but I think we have to begin to try to move things more forward in the central agencies in Ottawa. And there are a lot of barriers to that, and we need to talk about what those are, but we do need to really focus on this question of how do we increase local engagement. The second has very much to do with, while Africa is quite properly a focus for us, and it will continue to be because of the extent of the crisis in many countries in Africa, we need to look at the issues that are now emerging very clearly, for example, in the Americas, which I spoke about in my report. And I'm very glad to see that Canada has stepped up and said, yes, we will co-chair the council that has been established by UNHCR in their efforts to try to engage more regionally with issues. And I think the other major recommendation that I focus on is the need for us to appreciate that there has to be a much more political approach to dealing with the sources of conflict and with the potential resolution of those conflicts. It's a truism, I think it's been repeated many times, that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian crises. And so we have to engage. Canada has to have a better plan to engage more broadly in this whole issue of conflict resolution and looking at the underlying causes of the conflict. Ironically, when I wrote this report, I didn't know what was ahead for me. I'm now the chairman of the Peace Building Commission at the United Nations for another few months, and I'll be vice chair in the following year, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to understand better the sources of conflict and how that's connected to economic development and how that's connected to the resolution of refugee crises going forward. A lot more I could say. I think the other key recommendations that I've made have to do with education. And the final one is the need for us to engage host countries, refugees, and donor countries together in much more effective interaction. And that's something, again, which I'm hoping to initiate here. I've already had some discussions with people here about how we might move forward with that, as well as with our colleagues in Geneva. And I think that's going to be, I hope that's going to be helpful in really beginning for us to give a sense of how we're going to move beyond where we are. There's huge, I think, resentment and it's been aggravated by COVID, potential resentment in a number of host countries at what is perceived to be, oh, you're favoring the refugees. You're doing all this for refugees, you're not doing anything for us. So not only do we have to break down walls between humanitarian assistance and development, we also have to break down the walls between refugees and refugee camps and refugee settlements and the communities that surround them, and figure out ways of building development strategies that actually help everybody and will be of assistance to all. So I'll stop there. I really appreciate the chance to join you. I encourage people, if you haven't read the report yet, to read it. Certainly give me any feedback you'd like. And thank you so much for joining, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you for a wonderful introduction, setting the scene. Thank you for your work and the encouragement here to build better systems that make sure that the international support local efforts and how we can best do that, which is, I think, exactly where this panel will come in very, very nicely. As we had mentioned, there's 4 speakers, and I will just briefly introduce them. And it's my great honor and pleasure to first give the floor to Mustafa Alio, who is the co-chair of the Refugee Advisory Network and delegate to the Global Refugee Forum back in December 2019 as part of the Canadian delegation, and also co-founder of Jumpstart Refugee Talent. Mustafa, thanks so much for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ariane, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bob, for the comments, and James and everyone on the panel for giving me a chance today. I want to basically start with an introduction that today the global challenge of international refugee system has been inflamed by the COVID-19 pandemic that requires, as the report stated, a robust local, national, and global response, as advocated by Bob Rae in the report. The instrumental value of Bob Rae's presentation of this finding was in his efforts to collaborate with policymakers, governments, and especially refugee leaders, personal contributions that were compiled into a report. If anything today, I want to thank Bob just kind of to show one more example that refugees and us, we have the capacity and abilities to advise on co-create or even fully create such a valuable and significant report. Simply, enough is enough. Nothing about refugees should be without refugees. Refugee inclusion and engagement in policymaking, as well as directly supporting refugee-led organization, is both necessarily and forward-looking approach to ameliorate the current refugee system. The report acknowledged Canada's recent efforts on refugee inclusion, and just like IRC Minister Mendicino stated and called for, I strongly urge everyone on the panel and beyond that basically to truly follow the objective, to strongly urge other states to follow suits of Canada and then basically live up to the objective of the Global Compact. Canada is the first country ever to institutionalize refugee participation in its delegation and highest form of policy making. I'm proud and hopeful that Canada would not be the last. During COVID-19, it's been noticed that vastly documented that refugee leaders are in the front of responding to our community and needs. Refugee-led organizations have worked diligently to ensure that community received information, humanitarian aid, and economic supports. Victor Namori, who is in Amnesty Refugee Research, recently put it perfectly when he stated that refugee leaders have stepped in to fill these gaps left by states, traditional humanitarian actors during the pandemic, providing essential services and helping to mitigate the worst impacts of the crisis. Yet, these ROs are seldom part of the formal humanitarian response and are almost never capacitated, engaged, and financially supported adequately in the work they do. That actually makes me to bring one of the examples that it was mentioned in the book by Alex Betts, Estin Calabria, and Pincock, the Global Government and Refugee as Providers for Protection. Authors discuss the legitimization of beneficiary interaction and highlight refugees' own effort to create organization to provide the service and assistance over support supplied by other international humanitarian actors. For example, that really kind of, strike high tone with me is that in Kampala, the host, Kampala city that hosts nearly 100,000 refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has basically delegated its urban services program to one single national NGO called InterAid since 1995, despite the existence of over 30 refugee-led organizations in this city. And then when talked to basically refugees in that city, 90% of them stated that they would turn to their own community for support. Yet none of those basically 30 refugee-led organizations being funded or even seriously considered as an implementing or basically a serious partner to be on this. This example, like many others, basically I can tell you about, and just for the time I can't. I particularly encouraged everyone to basically laser focus attention and consider seriously recommendation 7 in a report, which kind of call and advocate for a direct funding and then support for refugee-led organization. The last point I want to bring from the report was basically education and economic empowerment. Additionally, evident in the report recommendations, government and organization funnel funding and resources into education as a tool to prevent extremism and navigate the consequences of refugees. I think funders and governments and policymakers should consider also addressing the report, the fact that we need to combine, or basically what the report actually mentioned exactly, unless education is linked to work, security, opportunity, and dignity, it will not alone be successful to fight against extremism and criminal and other exploitation. Furthermore, the economic and physical effects of the Granting Refugees Formal Labor Market Access brief found that employment empowerment alongside education practices led to multitude and other potential benefits, specifically to refugees, and decreased rates of prostitution, child labor, and child marriage, to encourage socially inclusive and cohesive societies. I think on this, I want to even mention one of the examples. 4 years ago, I met 14-year-old, I'm gonna say the name Sam, but it's not actually Sam, a kid who basically just got resettled in Canada from Lebanon. The kid was almost defensive, always defensive to everyone, has a very kind of fighty attitude. And then talking to Sam at many points in his family, the idea is that he has to work, and he was beating every single day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. to finish work and then barely getting paid. Although he loved school, but at that point he couldn't go to school even though he had access, but then he needed to provide his family with whatever that they can make just kind of to stay alive. So this is also just kind of, and I can mention more example. I also want to mention the white helmets, for example, inside Syria. Those are vetted people just with a small stipend monthly of $100 to $200. They were able to access more training, more education while doing the job.
I have to ask you to wrap up, Mustafa.
Sure. So at the end, my wrap up would be, and I just want to focus on this education/economic, but at the end, in the report also was mentioned that why we should care. Why do we care? I think if we don't care better now, these challenges are amplified alongside negative effects for communities. If you have any doubt toward this, just take a look at the world for the last 10 years. Today, the world, especially wealthy nations, have one of two options: either to perceive refugees as a threat or as economic burden against all the hard evidence that told us they are not so, and then basically invest the crazy resources in border control policies and populist strategies, or reconsider these ingrained stereotypes to realize the true value of refugees and migrants in general, then think of them as opportunities and people that can foster and prosper the collective interest. Finally, if you are to choose the second option, just keep in mind that the way to go forward is through refugee-led organization, refugee leaders working alongside with governments, funders, and decision makers to foster refugee inclusion in policy discussion and program delivery. This is our only hope for more efficient and operative solution for the global regime.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. Thank you so much for a great set of comments, introduction. Thank you for your leadership in Canada to give meaning to the importance of nothing for refugees without refugees. I've personally seen how this changed the narrative at the Global Refugee Forum with indeed the support of our minister. And thank you for highlighting that during times like now, the COVID crisis, with these efforts need to be intensified and need to be well resourced. Thank you so much for that. I'm then going to turn over to Linda. Linda, welcome. Linda Aucho is the Executive Director of the African Migration and Development Policy Center, which is based in Nairobi, Kenya. Linda, the floor is yours. Also 5 minutes, and I will remind you 1 minute ahead of time.
Okay, thank you so much, Aryan, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to comment on Bob Rae's report. It was actually very interesting and refreshing to kind of read about the realities of what has been happening, what Canada has been involved with in terms of their contribution to the refugee crisis. I was actually quite interested in the section where he highlighted the other crisis. And that actually highlighted aspects that I have come across myself in my work, because we do a lot of research-based work that's supposed to influence policy. And some of the things that he highlighted, like the problem being political, is something that I have observed and have noted in my area of work. So it was actually very good for me to actually understand that, at least from that perspective, that this is not just something unique in my country or my region, but it's something that is global, and we need to pay attention to it when we're trying to look at the refugee crisis. And I feel like his report also highlighted a few things that COVID-19 actually just revealed that actually existed, and that is the need to actually engage, empower, strengthen local actors on the ground, not only refugee-led, but also community-based, because they interact with each other in the same space with the same resources. So looking at what he had highlighted as examples, and I think Mustafa mentioned a few that Victor Nyamori had mentioned, that are quite critical and sometimes overlooked and not known about the contributions of refugee-led organizations, that they stepped up when the emergency was there, in this case of COVID-19, providing services like food, providing access to other healthcare facilities, or even just information. And that actually showed that they do have value. I know that in our region, in Kenya especially, we've been having the conversation about how refugees contribute to different forms of development, not only economic, social development. And we feel that it's critical for us to actually include them in the process. So some of the points I do definitely agree with Bob Rae, because it was quite honest and quite direct, and kind of gave us a sense of what is happening across the board. It was actually good to also listen to what read about what is happening in the Middle Eastern region and Latin America, and just knowing that it's not a unique experience in the region. So one of the things that I was looking at in the report, and was trying to bridge this debate that we've been having about humanitarian and development nexus. And in the region, and I'm sure in other places across the world, it's quite a challenge. We have a lot of discussions and interactions and strategies to kind of inform the way it should be done. But the reality is, when you go on the ground, there are several bottlenecks in the process. And I think it's key for us to sort of understand that they're unique to different regions. We can have different ideas and strategies to do that, but at the same time, we need to realize that we need to contextualize the solutions going forward. And that part actually raised more questions. So I hope Bob Rae doesn't mind me asking a few questions of his recommendations. And one of them is linked to one of the recommendations he made towards local organizations, and he talked about providing sufficient funding. And I think it's a question of whether funding is sufficient, or they need to actually build their capacities or strengthen. Let me use the word strengthen their capacities, because I think they have knowledge, they have agency, and they have experience, but sometimes it's just a matter of just amplifying that the skills and the knowledge that they have to do much more and to be more on the ground. And also, how can we learn from also this COVID-19 situation, where refugee-led organizations were partnering or even supporting community-based organizations in providing services, so that it actually reduces that tension that actually may arise as a result of what was mentioned earlier. Thank you, Ayan. And my other question is also, how do you talked about in your report the need to respect the refugee voices in organizations. And I feel like sometimes information gets stuck at the bottom, and how do we now bring it to the global forum? How do we put them in that position where they actually have a voice and a say in the process? I wish I could ask more questions, but I think my time is up, but I'm sure we'll have time to have a discussion about this. So thank you so much, Ayan.
I'm so sorry, Linda. Yes, time is short. We do want to leave time for questions from the audience as well. Thank you so much. Thank you for those questions. Thank you for highlighting the bottlenecks in the implementation and what we can do joint learning to help overcome those. Next then, welcome Maha. Great to see you. Maha Shuab is the director of the Center for Lebanese Studies at Lebanese American University. Maha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me today. Many of the things I wanted to mention have already been mentioned, so I'm going to focus on two main areas that have been mentioned in the report, and I would like to address them from the context of Lebanon in particular and Jordan, where my research is focused on. The first component or issue I would like to address is localization. It has become a buzzword recently, and obviously this is a really good thing, but localization needs to still be unpacked and problematized, because I think still the examples that we see sometimes on the ground is actually result in more marginalization. If we look at the case of Lebanon, and as Bob rightly said, everything happens within a political context. Everything is very politicized. What happened in Lebanon with localization is actually, I think, in my opinion, was a disadvantage to refugees. Within the context of the global north being, xenophobic to refugees, trying to limit and the influx of refugees to Europe, etc., and making sure that they stay in the global south, localization meant actually investing in the host government. That's where I feel the localization stayed. The government was given were given lots of power. They were given basically the lead on the response, which has meant a more inferior role to the refugees. All the system strengthening and all the investment has been basically given to the government. In my opinion, this created more dependency for refugees. Now they have to negotiate two problems. One, the displacement, and often these governments are, not very supportive and they offer half-hearted solutions or responses. So they have now, the refugees have to suffer with displacement, but at the same time, they inherited a weak system. Most of these hosting countries already have lots of their problems, and now refugees have to deal with these problems on top of their own issues. And this is what I feel localization has failed. Sometimes it's this negotiation that was happening between donors and local governments have meant that, let the government lead on this, give all the funding to the government and de-invest in local NGOs. What we see in Lebanon is an excellent example of this happening. In the beginning, refugee community jumped into the response. They were leading the interventions, supporting the local community, but then all the funding withdrew from the donors to the government as the hegemony of the government grew on all sectors. And this has weakened local organizations. If we see with COVID-19 what happened, the government was obviously couldn't even support its own citizens. It completely abandoned refugees. Now, our recent report of the impact of COVID-19 on education reveals that the vast majority of Syrian refugees in Lebanon will be completely left without education. Last year, all the interventions in the second shift for Syrian refugees stopped. It was left to teachers, up to them to teach the students or not. This year, till now, it's very vague. We don't know what's going to happen with Syrian refugees. So this is what I feel localization can lose its objective within this global scheme of negotiation. I have 1 minute left, and I want to address another issue which the report mentioned, which is, rightly, the refugees stay for 20 years in exile. We need to shift the discourse from humanitarian to development. Yet, what does that mean? Remains vague. It's still very undefined. We talk about system strengthening, yet when I interview policymakers, I say, okay, what are you doing for system strengthening? You see interventions aimed at nationals, but a humanitarian for refugees. So this is another issue where we need to understand what does it mean to do a development. And how can you development when still the response is very much sector-driven, each sector on its own. In a recent study that is funded by IDRC, which we're doing on the link between education and employment, which Mustafa referred to, we see a complete disconnection between education and employment, which renders education being only literacy. And here I would like to go back to localization. Interestingly, education-wise, more and more, the privileged people are moving to global frameworks of education. They're moving to IB, international baccalaureate, French baccalaureate, etc. While we're saying no refugees, you need to go in through the local system. These local systems that are weak are actually disadvantaging refugees more. So I think this is why it's very important to invest more time in thinking about what does development mean? How can we development across sectors? What does localization mean? How can we negotiate the issue of localization between the host government, but also the empowerment and strengthening of the refugee community? Thank you.
Maha, thank you so much, and also apologies. 5 minutes is not enough to do justice to the richness of your work. Thank you so much for the contributions you continue to make on the issue of localization, how that brings up local needs, local actors, and the complexity at local needs, as you just highlighted. So thank you so much for that. Our last panelist is Gregory. Welcome, Gregory. Gregory Maniatis is the director of the International Migration Initiative at Open Society Foundation. It's great to have you. Open Society Foundation is a fantastic international agency that's right at the heart of the debates on refugee issues. So thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours also for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, to James, for inviting me, to everyone for joining. Bob, it's great to see you, and congratulations on the report and on your latest gig in the heart of the international system. I think having you there is the greatest thing that's happened to refugee protection, I think, over the course of the past few years. So not to put too much pressure on you, but I think it's terrific. And I think I just want to make a few points. Those of you who know me have heard this before, but I really think it's important to center conversations like this with an analysis of the point we are in history. We're at a moment in history where the refugee protection system is both under tremendous strain and also just buckling from the pressures that are on it. And to understand why that is, I think have to go back to its origins, which I will not do in any pedantic way, but just to say that the system was established after decades of pressure, of displacement, and it only was established after World War II against the backdrop of the Holocaust, against the backdrop of an enormous international effort to find a home for the last million who were displaced by World War II. Canada played a very important role in that, took something like 37,000 of those last million. But even in Canada, it was decades longer before the system that we see there became grounded, especially when it comes to resettlement, a lot of political negotiation. And that Canadian negotiation had to do, was unfolded in the context of the Cold War. It unfolded against the backdrop of what was happening in Hungary and in the Czech Republic. Those were really the foundations of the resettlement system in Canada. And so I think it's important to understand that we collectively have lived through a period of kind of a halcyon period of a system that was established through the really, really hard work of others a long time ago, against a galvanizing set of global conflicts that really informed how the public viewed the idea of refugee protection. That's no longer the case. We have to make another political argument, and I have to say that that is a difficult thing to do, because we have relied as refugee advocates for now a long time against public and political opposition to refugee resettlement in particular, but also refugee protection. We've relied on the courts, we've litigated. I think we have to shift the form of litigation to the public space now and make a new case for why refugee protection matters. And I think it's eminently possible. So just to start with that, 3 points about Bob's report, which is, I think, important on many fronts. The banner under which it was published is Canadian leadership. And I cannot say how important that is, Bob, at a moment when, on the one hand, Canada has supplanted the US as the leader in resettlement, but also just supplanted the US and Europe as the most important voice on refugee protection. So that mantle is yours. And it might meet its counterpart in 33 days in the United States, in which case I think you have a generational opportunity or a multi-generational opportunity to create a US-Canadian transatlantic alliance on rethinking and rebuilding the refugee protection system. That is such an important political moment. I hope that it is seized if it so transpires. So you've talked a lot about refugee leadership. We obviously at OSF think it's incredibly important. I'm not going to go into the details. I've seen the notes from the first half hour of the session and see that you've dug in there. And there are people who are more qualified than I am, including on our own staff, Anna Crowley, who has led this work for us. I want to hit the second issue, which is resettlement. Got it. Where last night at 10:30 at night, an hour and a half before the deadline, the US government, the State Department transmitted to Congress that it was planning on only accepting 15,000 refugees in the United States. That's down, for those of you who are counting, from 110,000 under Obama, 153,000 under Reagan, and 130-something thousand under Bush. So it is a very low number, but it is, I think, incredibly important, not just to save lives, but also to build political support. This is something that we believe deeply in at OSF, that resettlement is not just about the refugees, it's about our communities and our communities' connection to global problems and to the idea of refugee protection. And finally, I just want to say to Bob, one of the things that excited me most in the report was the idea that Canada is going to or should take leadership on migration in the Americas. Here, I think it's really important to focus in on what is a relatively small problem, which is the Northern Triangle. I keep saying that I think we need to be able to solve refugee problems. If we do not take on discrete challenges like the Northern Triangle and solve them in a comprehensive manner, the challenge of refugee protection becomes too abstract for the public to believe in, that they want to instead turn away from it. And I think Canada, even on its own, but Canada with the new US administration could create the foundations of a new way of addressing displacement in the Americas, especially from the Northern Triangle on up. Thank you.
Gregory, thank you. Thank you so much. Again, 5 minutes is not enough time to do justice to your leadership, but thank you for the organization's leadership in Israel. Thank you for the points that you've highlighted, which I'm sure will come back in the debate. With that, I want to thank all the speakers and turn over back to James to lead the last part of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Arjan, and thank you to everyone. Thank you for everyone keeping the time. This leaves us 20 minutes for discussion, which is what we were hoping for. I see that there's a question in the Q&A box. Attendees are invited to pose questions there, which I will curate. But what I want to do is pick up on some points that we've heard in those introductory comments and pose two questions and ask each of the speakers to respond to the elements of these two questions that you'd like to pick up, and we'll go in the same order in which we spoke. So Bob, we'll start with you, then Mustafa, Linda, Maha, and Gregory as I curate what's in the Q&A. And the first question really comes to Gregory's last intervention, which I wholeheartedly support. That while we use the instruments of the global refugee regime, that those instruments now need to benefit from a new political argument, that there is this need to be able to demonstrate what the tools of the refugee regime are able to do, and what those new tools, what additional tools we need to add. And the point that I'd make, Bob, is we've talked about this. Your report comes hot on the heels of the New York Declaration, the Global Compact, and the arguments of the Global Refugee Forum about refugee inclusion and humanitarian development nexus and linking these various tools. So the question that I have is, the world is a very different place than when we gathered in Geneva in December of 2019. And out of this moment that we have right now, I'd like to, my first question is, what do you all see as the political opportunity that we have to take these arguments and translate them into action? Is there something particular about this global moment, or this global moment in 33 or 38 days? Is there something about the moment before us that we need to recognize and act upon? That's my first question. My second question relates, Linda, to a point that you raised about, it's all well and good to make reference to refugee inclusion and refugee participation, about local perspectives. But as we found, Mustafa, at the Global Refugee Forum in December 2019, that out of 3,000 participants, some 70 of whom were refugee leaders. So how to increase those numbers, but also we're just coming out of the high-level week of the UN General Assembly, and we see all of the frailties of multilateralism and collective action. The report calls for Canadian leadership, but Canada can't do all of this on its own. So in thinking where and how new voices can be brought in, or voices can be amplified, also with a very political question of how we get those voices into the conversation at the global level, so that they are not simply a box-ticking exercise, but substantively contribute to the direction of the conversation. How do we turn that rhetoric in reality? So first question is, what is the political moment that we have now, and how do we seize it? And the second question is, how do we move from rhetoric to reality to make sure that those engaged in the policy discussions at the global level are those who are meaningfully engaged with the realities of these phenomenon in a lived way? So with Bob, let me start with you, Bob, and then we'll go through the order in which the speakers had the floor. So Bob, over to you.
Thank you, James. And I hope at some point I get a chance to answer the points that have been made particularly by Linda and Ma, because I think they're very important, and I would like to engage with them on it. If not now, we can do it in some other way. But on the first point about is it a moment of engagement? I mean, absolutely it is. But one of the things that I believe very strongly is if you don't make the political argument, you don't have a hope in hell of succeeding. Like, you can't wait for somebody else to make the argument. Of course, there's resistance. We all know that there's an increase in xenophobia, there's an increase in nativism, an increase in nationalism. We've seen signs of this all over the world. No country is immune from it, and we're seeing it growing. But if you don't fight back and don't make the argument as to why that actually doesn't make any sense at the moment, we're not going to get very far. So I definitely believe there's a moment, but I think the question is who's prepared to seize it? And I argue in my report that we should be prepared to seize it in Canada. I'm hoping to keep on making that point, but it requires persistence because we need to remind everybody, and this is where I guess I think the argument I think has to be couched at least in good measure in self-interest, and not just in the language of solidarity, not just in the language of morality, which I've certainly over my lifetime have used a great deal. But I think in order to be successful, we have to persuade people, just as the United States did in the Marshall Plan in the late 40s and early 50s, is to say, yes, we're spending money, yes, we're doing this, yes, we're investing somewhere else, yes, we're helping others, but actually we're helping ourselves, because if we don't, if the world isn't bigger than just us, we're in trouble. And I use that language in my report. I mean, I talk quite a lot about, how do you do this? And part of it seems to me is, and it's sometimes very difficult for humanitarians of various kinds to accept the argument, because people are much more comfortable talking in the language of humanitarianism. We have to reach out, we have to do the right thing, we have to show solidarity with other people. Yes to all of the above. That's not going to be enough to move the needle to where we need to move it. We have to continue to convince people that it's actually in our interest to create a better refugee system, a stronger system than we have. And in answer to part of your second question, we actually have to take the human footsteps to make resettlement happen. We have to show some examples of where we actually can make progress and where we can actually resolve issues. The problem I have with throwing around the big numbers, and you say, well, there's so many refugees, say, yeah, but there's so many other displaced people, it's getting close to 100 million people now. And you say, well, what are you trying to do? Convince people that it's hopeless? No, you have to convince people that it's something we can help to resolve. And I think that's where we need to focus on. And I'm glad that Gregory picked up on the one of the reasons I focused on the Americas was this is an issue the United States is going to have to deal with, and it's an issue that Canada can help with. And so why wouldn't we try to play a key role? It doesn't mean we do less in Lebanon, or we do less in Bangladesh, or we do less in Kenya or in other parts of Africa. It just means that has to be added to our roster of where we try to be effective. And I think the more we can show people that this formula of focusing on the political causes, linking it to the reasons for conflict, tying it more to economic development and to the possibilities for education and so on, and then add the additional element of resettlement, which we should never lose. Resettlement is not going to solve everything, but resettlement does solve some things, and it does help to, I think it helps to further this international solidarity, which we're trying to increase. And I think the concept of local sponsorship and engaging local communities in the act of resettlement has been a critical initiative which Canada has championed, and I think it's a right thing for us to do. And I will engage with Ma and Linda on their points, because I think they're exceptionally important.
Thank you very much, Bob. Mustafa, let's turn to you for your thoughts, and then Linda, Maha, and Gregory. Go ahead, Mustafa.
Thank you, James. I think with every problem, there is an opportunity. Today, there are two sides to this argument today to seize the moment. So there is one where refugee-led organizations and refugee in camps and other areas showed an example today that they're beneficial and that they have the capacity and ability to respond not only to refugees, but also to support local communities. I know we've seen refugee-led organizations in East Africa, Lebanon, and Jordan actually right now, especially after a few unfortunate incidents that happened, that they stepped up and that they start actually supporting those locals. So there are those kind of small spotlights and examples that we can take and amplify to kind of perceive refugees again as a community, and then people and the talent and opportunities in a way that not to support refugees themselves, but also to support the local communities and hosting countries. I think the other one that definitely Canada's leadership on the, let's say, the engagement and the inclusion of refugees on policies and in political discussion today, we are seeing that Canada is living up to its commitment by having the second refugee advisor ever on the delegation for the ExCom, that basically Melwell would be there in there. So definitely this is a leadership that I hope Canada will take, and then take it one step at a time, that to talk to other partners and nations, that even if we have one other country for the next delegation that they have a refugee, and then, you know, to increase this, those kind of work on the ground, in addition to kind of a little bit on policies, including refugees on the top, hopefully they, you know, those are moments that we can build on. They don't have to happen. I know it's not going to be easy, but we definitely can build on. We have the grounds that Canada laid there and then put there, we can take a leadership. I think the last point I'm going to mention really quickly in terms of the resettlement, yes, very important, and maybe Bob mentioned this, is that to also maybe rethink of resettlement, not only as a solution for refugees. Is it a solution, one of the solutions for refugees, but also we can think of resettlement today as a solution for other Asian nations in a way. There are small towns, and then there are basically areas in different countries where they are almost dying and all of that, and then resettlement to bring a young and fresh and the people who are motivated and excited to have a piece and contribute. This is also a solution, not for refugees, but also a solution for some nations and some other basically resettlement countries.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. Linda, if we can go to you, please.
Yeah, I think for me, the political situation that we can see is actually what has been created by COVID-19. Because COVID-19 has actually put certain policies and laws to task. Is it actually working? Is the solution that we adopted or the strategy that has been adopted really working? And if it's not working, what do we need to do to change, and who should be involved in that conversation? And I feel like this actually is asking us to revisit this conversation of, for example, durable solutions. We've seen about the resettlement rates are very low. Local integration in some countries is not possible because that requires you to politically engage with certain countries that may not be open to that idea. And return and reintegration depends on the security and safety of a country. So I think what has created this COVID-19, although it's the worst case scenario in the sense that it is an issue that we have to deal with, but the reality is that it is asking us to revisit those policy strategies that have been adopted by different countries and different regions, and also learn also from the global south what other strategies they're using that actually is working. It may not work in their context, but you can consider it and contextualize it for different countries. But also, I think I saw a question that was raised by one of the attendees, and I thought it was important to raise that we should not only focus on the pandemic as it is and what happens now, but what happens after. What do we do in the recovery period? Because once we go to the recovery period, are we going back to the same way we've been handling displacement in general? What do we do to support those voices? And that comes to that point you brought about amplifying the voices. I don't think it's just only putting them in a space in the global forum to talk about what they're doing, but it's to actually support them throughout the chain, the value chain of the ecosystem that exists, so that when they're on the ground, they're able to engage. They're also able to engage at a macro level with the policymakers, but also be part of the process and the solution. And that should be done jointly. But how it should be done, I don't know, but I think it's something that we can consider as a discussion going forward. But I think the political situation right now has been created by COVID-19. So that's my quick point.
Thank you, Linda. And Maha, let's turn it over to you, because there's also, that links to a point that you made in terms of, you know, one of the motivations of the kinds of responses that we saw before the pandemic was really driven by this preoccupation on containment. So how the types of questions that I pose also speak to the sort of the deep-seated interest in what the end goal of the kind of responses are that we've seen before the pandemic. So Maha, over to you.
Okay, so, you know, the past 10 years, I think, have been really something that we will not be very proud of. I think, you know, what we've seen, for instance, in the Olympics with the participation of the refugee team, I think this is a moment when we should feel a bit ashamed of how the situation we've got into, that now we have to have a special team for refugees to represent refugees. It just shows how in the last 10 years, even before pandemic, we've been closing down our borders, closing down all the support that we can give, and instead celebrating these you know, achievements of refugees, this reification of refugee, where every simple thing that a refugee does becomes so exceptional. I think it comes from our lack of interest, of real engagement, real you know, integration. So this is how we create these parallel systems. I don't know. I think, unfortunately, you know, the situation is going to be even worse now with the lack of resources. I think refugees are going to be pushed more on to the margin. So I'm personally not very optimistic, but I think what Bob says is critical. This is all part of a political, you know, there's a political solution that this cannot be solved without a political solution. If we look in Lebanon now, into Lebanon, we have another crisis, refugees. No one is talking about refugees. No one is talking what's happening, going to happen to the 1 million refugee in Lebanon. We're not interested in them. In the beginning, even we didn't count the casualties of the Syrian, you know, people who were killed in Beirut blast. They were, you know, not even included in the list. So more and more, as the crisis is going to be getting worse, I think refugees are going to be affected worse. We will see more migration, illegal, you know, people escaping in boats, drowning in the sea. So I think if there isn't a political moment where some of the roots of these issues are you know, resolved, the situation is not going to be to get better. But also I think it's a moment for us to have the humility to sit, think, and reflect of whatever has happened in the past 10 years. What are some of the lessons that we've learned that we can now address? What does it mean when we say localization or development? I think it's a moment for us to sit also and reflect on this.
Thank you very much, Maha. And we're going to come to that in the last round of questions. We started 5 minutes late, so I'm going to ask 5 more minutes of everyone's time. Gregory, a response to you from that first set of questions, then I'm going to offer some of the curated questions that have come in the Q&A box before I turn it back to Ariane to conclude us by 10:35 Ottawa time. So Gregory, over to you, please.
Thanks. Just really quickly to underscore Linda's point about how the pandemic is a political argument on some of the changes that we're talking about. It's very clear and it's powerful. We've seen it not just in refugee-led organizations, but with essential workers. There is public sentiment on our side on this point. And I think the second point that I'd like to underscore is what Bob said, that we have evolved in some ways in a good way to making the case for refugee protection through a humanitarian and compassion lens. But we have to go back to a self-interest lens, and there's many arguments for it. But you know, I was reading the history of the Canadian Resettlement Program, and the government was backing up resettlement for one reason, which was economic, for the first many decades until the late 70s. And I just go back to that. There was wisdom in that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gregory. We've had a number of questions in the Q&A box, which are very helpful, and it's regrettable at this time with such a short webinar, but let me curate them into 2 questions that I'll pose to all of you as a way of having some final thoughts, and we'll go in reverse order. So Gregory, we'll start with you, and then Maha, Linda, Mustafa. Bob, I'll invite you to have your last point, and Ariane, I'll then turn it over to you to conclude before we end the webinar. Questions that we've had from Jennifer Heineman and Elise Zapparoli Bodson and others have raised questions about essentially the political economy argument, that while there has been rhetorical commitments to humanitarian development in terms of self-reliance, that this can often be a catchphrase for mitigation and containment. And get us further away from the core objective of the refugee regime, which is solutions. You know, the average duration of a refugee situation today is 20 years. And so going back to Maha's point in terms of looking at what we've done in the last 10 years, and I would go back further than that, that through the 1990s, but there has been this underlying logic of trying to insulate arrivals in the global north that don't conform to these notions of the paths through which individuals should come and seek protection. Notwithstanding the fact that human mobility has been a defining part of the human history for over 200,000 years. So my first question is really, as we think about this new response, how do we take Maha's point seriously to avoid the trap of these localized responses, the humanitarian development nexus, encouraging self-reliance? How do we make sure that this doesn't become a perpetuation of the logic of containment? And then a second question that's come in that I'm combining together is, how do we build this logic? How do we avoid falling back into the same traps, while at the same time recognizing that we face these pressures from above and these pressures from below? The questions about the number of people displaced as a result of climate change, for example, is open to debate, and there's been some questioning about that. But there are other drivers of displacement, and as Bob mentioned in his report, the numbers are only likely to increase. So it raises the question of how we respond more effectively while facing pressures from above, but also pressures from below, recognizing that domestic budgets, not only in Canada, but around the world, that citizens are placing increasing demands on those budgets. So as we need to have a political response, how do we make sure that the political response is reflective of a shared interest as opposed to self-interest? And how do we pursue this shared vision at a time where we face these pressures from above and these pressures from below? And Gregory, I know I can put you on the spot to answer those meaty questions. And so just 30 seconds from each of you to share thoughts on that before we turn to Ariane for conclusion. So Gregory, over to you, please.
We have to fundamentally rebuild the resettlement system. There is a problem on both sides. On one side, we have a really thin neck of a funnel, 25 to 30 million refugees. We rely on UNHCR to determine who should be able to go. We need to vastly open those channels up for labor pathways, education pathways, family reunification, not just vulnerability criteria. It is a tragedy that we have allowed this to happen. And on the other side, there is political will. There are, in Europe, hundreds of cities in Germany and the Netherlands that want to take in more refugees. Same is true in the United States. 42 governors. The national governments are blocking that. We have to overcome that.
Thank you, Gregory. Maha, over to you, please.
I would totally second what Gregory just said. But I think also, in addition to that, we have to look at, the existing approaches to working with the host government, how we're going to work with them, how we're going to hold them more accountable, how we're going to also introduce some useful guidelines for how to, have a more effective educational interventions instead of creating parallel segregation that leads to very low outcomes in terms of educational outcomes. I think some guidelines for also host government will be very helpful, and some accountability, because I think we also have another big issue with accountability of the host government and obviously the international community towards refugees. But I think certainly more settlement and more political solutions to the problems.
Thank you, Maha. Linda, over to you, please.
Thank you, James. I think a lot of what Gregory and Maha has said, I actually agree with it. And I think it's trying to find that fine balance, and also just learning from what has happened in the past 20 years to kind of refine that and see what actually works. So I don't want to repeat what they've just said, but I think that's also one of the aspects that we need to consider and actually see what does that balance look like in terms of pressures from the bottom and pressures from the top, and how do you find that middle ground where each person or each organization or each group can actually benefit from that process. So that's my quick response.
Yeah, and I'm just going to, just jump on that point, Mustafa, before we turn to you. We've done it before and we can do it again. When you look historically, there have been these moments where we have wrestled and used self-interests to leverage solutions for very large and complex refugee situations. So the art of the possible is there if we learn the lessons of history. Anyway, that's my editorial 2 cents. Mustafa, over to you, please.
Very quickly on, and also take it from lessons of history. I mean, the number one step, I think, is just to acknowledge and realize that the system failed. The billions of dollars that being spent in the years, people and refugees keep fleeing those billions of dollars and then and keep fleeing and then not happy with those programs and all of that. So we need to acknowledge that there is a failing system, that we need to change it. We need to change narratives around refugees. We need to think of them as solutions, as well as a humanitarian causes and responsibilities in that way. That we are seeing, like, again, you mentioned kind of pressure from the top and from bottom. So today, those voices are getting bigger. It's just kind of, how can we make it normal? How can we normalize the participation of refugees? How can we normalize the solution? How can we normalize the acknowledgement of failing and just to try it a little bit differently? And yes, to rethink resettlements and solution for refugees a little bit differently, to a little bit rethink out of the box. And last things, it's okay to recreate the wheel because the wheel is broken. That's fine, not kind of to get stuck into those things. We need to think a little bit differently.
Bob, from three continents, voices cheering you on. Last word to you before I turn it back to Ariane for words of thanks in conclusion.
Well, let me thank everybody. And just to clarify one point I wanted, with respect to what Muab said, I think that by localization, I don't mean giving all the money to host governments. I think we have to look at a new system of governance that connects host countries, refugees, and international donors and agencies. But my main thrust of what I was trying to say was we need to empower refugees themselves and recognize that they are people who have deep interests, and the things that you've described are, I think, troubling to everybody. The idea that refugees would have no access to education, not just because of COVID, but because of other problems, is an issue that we have to fight right across the board. It's a major issue that we now need to deal with. I guess my last point would be to say this is, we're never going to find the perfect solution. And so we have to accept that. But we do have to find solutions with an S, because, here I really want to pick up what Linda said, and that is, don't come in with a theory about what the answer is, because the answers won't work in some communities and they won't work in some places. But if we start from the premise that we need to listen to the refugees and let them tell us what they think is going to work for them, that then allows, the world will not necessarily say, okay, we're going to do that right away. You're going to say, well, here's how we can help to respond to that. We have to create the dialogue, the places where dialogue can happen, and the places where empowerment can happen, and the places where action can happen. And that is global, because host countries have to respond, the donors have to respond, and those who are accepting people who are resettling have to respond. And there does need to be a change, because this problem is not getting better on its own, and it is an issue that we have to deal with globally. And as I said, I think ultimately it requires political leadership to begin to get the countries and people together who can begin to solve it. But I really have appreciated this conversation very, very much. It's been great.
Thank you, Bob. Ariane, over to you to close us off.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for the participants. Sorry, running a little bit over time. I want to extend my thanks and gratitude to a fantastic panel. Thank you, everybody, for your contribution. It highlights very important priorities, and I just want to thank everybody for spending the time to put these on the agenda, continue this debate, and the leadership that you all have in those different in your different parts of those 3 or 4 continents. This is a global problem with needing global and local solutions. So thank you, everybody, for your leadership in that. And the last thing I want to say is that this is the beginning of a series of webinars, and we will send all participants, and please follow the messages on social media as well for the announcement of the next one. And we very much hope that to see you there again and to continue this debate, probably diving deeper in some of the issues that are raised here. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Peace.
Bye-bye.